Rain lashed against the towering windows of the estate, drowning out the distant wail of city sirens. Inside, the city's most feared man stood swaying in a dimly lit hallway. He didn't hold a weapon. He held a half-empty bottle of aged scotch. His knuckles were bruised, his bespoke suit ruined beyond repair. When he raised a heavy fist to knock on the unassuming door at the end of the servants' corridor, it wasn't an order. It was a plea. He just needed to breathe. The estate was usually a tomb by 2 in the morning. Clara Bennett preferred it that way. She sat by the small window of her ground floor quarters, a paperback novel resting face down on her lap. The radiator hissed, a comforting, rhythmic sound that drowned out the oppressive silence of the mansion above her. She liked the dark. She liked the quiet. In a house filled with men who spoke in ultimatums and carried heavy iron beneath their coats, invisibility was the only real currency a maid possessed. Clara was a billionaire in that regard. She kept her head down. She scrubbed the imported marble. She ignored the muffled shouts that occasionally echoed from the basement. Then came the footsteps. They were wrong. The estate guards walked with a measured, predatory cadence, heel to toe, purposeful, alert. These steps dragged. They scuffed against the hardwood, hesitating, heavy with an exhaustion that vibrated through the floorboards. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the small brass lamp on her nightstand. She held her breath. The footsteps stopped outside her door. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the muffled sound of the storm outside. Then, a knock. 3 dull, uncoordinated thuds. Clara didn't move. The rules of the house were simple. Servants did not exist outside of daylight hours unless summoned by the intercom. A knock at her bedroom door at this hour meant trouble. The kind of trouble that ended with a severance package handed over by a man who didn't smile. Clara, the voice was a low, jagged rasp. It was barely loud enough to carry through the solid oak of the door, but it hit her chest like a physical weight. Arthur Moretti, her employer, the architect of half the organized crime on the eastern seaboard. A man who supposedly didn't sleep, didn't bleed, and certainly didn't wander the servants' corridors in the dead of night. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, the hinges whining softly. Arthur stood in the threshold. He looked like a building right after a demolition charge had been detonated, still standing, but crumbling from the inside out. His tie was gone. The top 3 buttons of his ruined, blood-speckled dress shirt were torn open, exposing a chest rising and falling with erratic, shallow breaths. He gripped a crystal bottle of scotch by the neck, his knuckles split and weeping dark crimson. He didn't look at her face. His hollow, dark eyes were fixed on the cheap, braided rug at her feet. "Mr. Moretti," Clara said, her voice strictly neutral. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask what happened. Pragmatism was her armor. He swayed, his broad shoulder knocking against the door frame. The smell of him hit her then, a bitter concoction of expensive peat smoke, rain, sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of violence. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. The confession was so raw, so utterly devoid of his usual terrifying composure, that Clara actually stepped back. He didn't sound like a boss. He sounded like a man drowning in a bathtub, finally realizing he couldn't reach the surface. He looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, glassy with liquor, and a profound bone-deep fatigue. I didn't know where else. He took a step forward, his knee buckling. Clara moved before she could think. She caught him by the bicep. The muscle beneath the ruined fabric was tense as coiled steel, but he surrendered his weight to her instantly. He was heavy, impossibly heavy. But she dug her heels into the floorboard, absorbing his collapse, and dragged him inside. She kicked the door shut with her heel. The latch clicked, sealing them in the small, warm room. Arthur stood in the center of her quarters, looking entirely out of place. His sheer size made the ceiling seem lower, the walls tighter. He blinked at her narrow twin bed, the faded floral quilt, the small stack of library books on the floor. "Sit," Clara instructed. It wasn't a suggestion. To her surprise, he obeyed. He sank onto the edge of her mattress. The bed frame groaned violently under his weight. He placed the scotch bottle on the floor with exaggerated drunken care, then buried his face in his hands. Clara stood by the door, her arms crossed over her cheap cotton robe. She watched his shoulders shake, just once, a violent, repressed tremor, before he went completely still. "Do I need to call Dr. Aries?" she asked quietly, referencing the discreet physician on the family payroll. Arthur shook his head without looking up. "No holes in me tonight, Clara." "Just other people's holes, then." It slipped out. A cynical, dangerous observation. A Maid did not speak to the head of the Moretti family about the blood on his shirt. Arthur dropped his hands and looked at her. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire between them. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was the ghost of one. "Just other people's," he agreed, his voice rough as sandpaper. He leaned back against the plain white wall, his dark hair leaving a faint damp mark on the plaster. "I'm tired, Clara. I am so fucking tired." The digital clock on Clara's nightstand blinked 2:14 a.m. Arthur Moretti was ruining her quilt. His charcoal slacks were damp with rain and grime, and the split skin on his right hand was slowly dripping onto the faded floral pattern. Clara stared at the spreading red dot for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to her tiny adjoining bathroom. She turned on the tap, letting the water run until it was scalding hot. She soaked a clean white washcloth, wrung it out, and grabbed a small plastic first aid kit from beneath the sink. When she returned, Arthur hadn't moved. His eyes were closed, his head resting back against the wall. The harsh overhead light caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the deep grooves bracketed around his mouth and the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath his eyes. He looked older than his 34 years. He looked like a man who had traded his soul for an empire and suddenly realized he was shortchanged in the transaction. "Give me your hand," Clara said. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at the steaming cloth in her hand, then up at her face. He didn't move. Clara didn't wait for permission. She reached down, took his thick wrist, and pulled his right hand toward her. He flinched slightly at the contact, not from pain, but as if he wasn't used to being touched without an agenda. She sat in the small wooden chair opposite the bed, placing his ruined hand on her knee. The knuckles were a mess of torn skin and swelling purple bruises. "This is going to sting," she said. She pressed the hot, damp cloth against the cuts, Arthur hissed, his jaw clenching hard enough to pop the muscle in his cheek, but he didn't pull away. "You should be terrified," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet room. Clara wiped away a smear of drying blood, revealing a deep gash over his middle knuckle. "Of the sting." "Of me." Clara didn't look up. She meticulously cleaned the wound, her touch firm and clinical. "Fear takes too much energy, Mr. Moretti. I need mine to do the laundry in the morning." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough. "That's it? Pragmatism? It keeps me employed and alive." She opened the first aid kit, fishing out a tube of antiseptic ointment. "Besides, you're sitting on a lumpy mattress in a maid's room, reeking of alcohol and self-pity. You don't look very terrifying right now." He stared at the top of her head. The silence returned, but the sharp edges had been sanded down. It felt heavier now, thicker. "I gave an order tonight," Arthur said. The words fell out of him, unprompted, heavy with a suffocating guilt. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring straight ahead at the blank wall, seeing ghosts. It was the right call, the necessary call. The business demanded it. If I didn't give it, we looked weak. If we look weak, the sharks circle. Clara dabbed the ointment onto his knuckles. She said nothing. She knew the mechanics of his world. She didn't need the details to know someone had died tonight, because Arthur Moretti nodded his head. "I watched it happen," he continued, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "And I felt nothing, not a goddamn thing, no regret, no triumph, just empty." He looked back down at her. The vulnerability in his eyes was staggering. It felt obscene to witness it, like walking in on a man flaying himself alive. "I came back here," he said, his breathing growing shallow again. "I poured a drink. I stood in my office looking at the city, and the walls just started closing in. The air turned to water. I couldn't breathe, Clara. I felt like I was buried alive under all this money, all this power. It's a coffin." Clara finished taping a stark white gauze pad over his knuckles. She kept her hands resting lightly on his wrist. It was a grounding gesture, a tether to keep him from floating away into his own dark psychology. "You're having a panic attack, Arthur," she said. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. It hung in the air between them, casual and intimate. He didn't correct her. He didn't reprimand her. He just stared at her hand on his wrist, focusing on the warmth radiating from her skin. "Is that what this is?" he asked, sounding genuinely confused. The ruthless tactician, entirely undone by his own nervous system. "Yes, your brain is trying to process what your conscience is finally catching up to." Clara released his hand and sat back in her chair. She looked him dead in the eye. "You aren't a machine. You can only bury the body so deep before the smell starts waking you up at night." It was a dangerous thing to say, a fatal thing to say in any other room, to any other version of this man. But Arthur just stared at her, the frantic energy slowly draining out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out husk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. "Why did I come to your door, Clara?" he asked to the floorboards. "Out of all the doors in this house. Because I'm the only one here who doesn't want anything from you," she answered simply. "I just want my paycheck on Friday, and a quiet hallway. He reached out slowly, his uninjured hand finding hers where it rested on her lap. His fingers were cold, calloused, and trembling slightly. He didn't grip her hand. He just rested his over it, a silent, desperate anchor. "Don't make me go back upstairs," he whispered. "Not yet." Clara looked at his bowed head, at the expensive fabric clinging to his broad, burdened shoulders. She knew she should tell him to leave. She knew the boundaries between employer and employee, between civilian and Mafia royalty, were there for a reason. Crossing them meant stepping into the line of fire. "I have a long shift tomorrow," Clara lied quietly. Arthur's shoulders slumped further. "Just an hour." She didn't pull her hand away. "1 hour." He didn't leave in an hour. Clara hadn't expected him to. Sometime around 3:30 in the morning, the alcohol and the adrenaline crash had conspired against him. Arthur had slumped sideways onto her bed, his long legs dangling awkwardly off the edge, and passed out cold. Clara hadn't slept. She remained in the hard wooden chair, a solitary sentinel in the dark. She watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. In sleep, the lethal edge of Arthur Moretti vanished. His features softened, the deep lines of stress smoothing out. He looked peaceful. He looked utterly normal. It was a deceptive, dangerous illusion. When the first gray streaks of dawn began to bleed through the small window, Clara stood. Her back ached, a dull throb at the base of her spine. The estate would be waking up soon. The night guards would swap with the day shift. The kitchen staff would begin prepping breakfast. The illusion was over. She walked over to the bed. "Mr. Moretti." He didn't stir. Clara reached down and shook his shoulder, her grip firm. "Arthur, wake up." His eyes snapped open. There was no groggy transition between sleep and wakefulness. 1 second he was out. The next, his dark eyes were wide, alert, and tracking the room with predatory speed. His hand shot instinctively toward his waistband, searching for a weapon he had left upstairs. Then he saw Clara. He saw the peeling paint on the ceiling, the cheap clock reading 6:15 a.m. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The hangover slammed into him a second later. He groaned, squeezing his eyes shut as he pressed the heels of his hands into his temples. "Water is on the nightstand," Clara said, her voice brisk, void of the quiet intimacy they had shared hours ago. The sun was up. The rules were back in play. Arthur sat up slowly, the bed frame whining in protest. He looked down at his right hand. The neat white gauze was a stark contrast to his ruined clothes. The memory of the night before rushed back in fragmented, humiliating flashes. The panic, the desperate knock, the confession. He reached for the glass of water, his hand shaking slightly, and downed it in one go. When he looked at Clara, the mask was back on. It was a little crooked, a little fractured around the edges, but the cold, calculating Mafia boss had returned to inhabit his body. His jaw was set. His eyes were flat, guarded. He stood up, towering over her in the cramped room. He adjusted his torn collar, a futile attempt to reclaim his dignity. "This," Arthur began, his voice rough and stripped of emotion. He cleared his throat. "What happened last night? The lapse in judgment. You had a few too many drinks, sir, and got turned around in the hallways," Clara supplied smoothly, turning away to make her own bed. She pulled the stained quilt up, hiding the dried blood. You sat down for a moment and fell asleep. That's all. Arthur stared at her back. He heard the out she was offering him. A clean, sanitized version of events that protected his ego and her employment. It was exactly what he wanted to hear. It was exactly what he needed to maintain the untouchable aura required to run his family. But it felt like a lie that burned his throat. "Right," he muttered. Clara turned to face him, her expression pleasant and entirely vacant. The perfect servant. "I'll need to requisition some heavy-duty stain remover for the rug, Mr. Moretti. I hope that won't be an issue." Arthur looked at the rug. Then he looked at her. He hated the blankness in her eyes. He hated that she could flip the switch so easily, locking him out after he had cracked his chest open for her in the dark. "I'll have a new rug sent down," he said stiffly. "That isn't necessary, sir." "I'll have it sent down," he repeated, a hard edge of authority bleeding into his tone. It was a pathetic attempt to assert control in a room where he had surrendered all of it. Clara bowed her head slightly. "Thank you, sir." Arthur lingered near the door. His hand rested on the brass knob. He knew he needed to turn it. He needed to walk down the hall, take the service stairs up to his sprawling, empty wing, shower, change into a $6,000 suit, and go back to being a monster. He didn't want to turn the knob. He looked back at Clara. She was already gathering her uniform for the day from a small closet. She wasn't looking at him. She had already moved on. "Clara," he said softly. She paused, looking over her shoulder. Arthur opened his mouth to say something. "Thank you." Or maybe, "I meant what I said." Or perhaps, "Don't look at me like I'm just your boss." But the words wouldn't come. The weight of his world was already settling back onto his shoulders, crushing the fragile human thing that had briefly lived in this room last night. "Make sure my office is cleaned before noon," he said instead. His voice was cold, dead. Clara's expression didn't change. "Of course, Mr. Moretti." Arthur turned the knob, stepped out into the quiet, pristine hallway, and closed the door firmly behind him. Inside the room, Clara stood perfectly still until the sound of his heavy footsteps faded entirely. She looked at the chair she had sat in all night. She looked at the indentation his head had left on her pillow. She sighed, a tired, cynical sound, and reached for her uniform. The boundaries had been redrawn in the harsh morning light. But as Clara buttoned her plain gray dress, she knew the truth. You couldn't show a starving man a feast and expect him to forget the taste. Arthur Moretti had found a quiet place to hide from his demons. He would be back. The new rug arrived at 10 in the morning. Clara was halfway through polishing the grand staircase when two burly men in coveralls carried a long, plastic-wrapped cylinder down the servants' corridor. They left it propped against her door. When her shift ended at 3, Clara dragged it inside and cut the heavy zip ties. It wasn't a rug. It was a woven tapestry of hand-dyed Persian silk, rich in deep crimsons and midnight blues. It belonged in a museum, or, at the very least, in the sprawling formal dining room upstairs. It did not belong on the chipped linoleum floor of a maid's quarters. It was a ridiculous, heavy-handed apology wrapped in a display of wealth. Clara rolled it back up and shoved it beneath her narrow twin bed. She preferred the cheap braided cotton. It didn't demand attention. At 4 o'clock, she carried her wooden caddy of cleaning supplies up to the 3rd floor. Arthur's office was located at the end of the west wing, guarded by thick double doors of solid mahogany. The rules regarding the office were strict. Clean only when empty, touch nothing on the desk, empty the shredder, leave no trace. She opened the doors. The room smelled of expensive cigar smoke, leather, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. Arthur was sitting behind the desk. Clara stopped in the doorway, her grip tightening on the handle of her caddy. He was on the phone, his voice a low, even murmur that carried absolutely no inflection. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing a dark, intricate tattoo of a crest on his left forearm. His right hand, the hand she had bandaged 12 hours ago, rested flat on the glass surface of the desk. The white gauze had been replaced by flesh-colored medical tape. He didn't look up when she entered. He just kept talking into the receiver. Clara took a step back, preparing to close the doors. Clean only when empty. Arthur raised his left hand, holding up a single finger. Wait. He finished the call, placing the receiver in its cradle with a soft click. The silence in the massive room was immediate and oppressive. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. His dark eyes locked onto hers. The vulnerability of the previous night was entirely gone, sealed behind a wall of cold, calculated authority. "The room is occupied, sir," Clara said, keeping her voice flat. "I'll return later." "Come in, Clara. Close the doors." She hesitated for a fraction of a second. She stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut. The click of the latch echoed like a gunshot. "Did the rug arrive?" he asked. "It did. Thank you, sir. It was entirely unnecessary." "I ruined the other one." "It was a $15 rug from a discount store. You sent me 2 months' rent in silk." Clara set her caddy down on the floor. "It doesn't fit the room." Arthur tilted his head slightly. The ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Are you complaining about a gift, Clara?" "I am stating a logistical fact, Mr. Moretti." He watched her for a long moment. He was dissecting her tone, searching for a crack in her professional veneer. He wanted her to acknowledge the night before. He wanted her to bring it up so he could control the narrative, frame it, and put it in a neat little box. Clara didn't give him the satisfaction. She walked over to the leather sofa and began meticulously wiping down the mahogany end tables with lemon oil. "I have a meeting at 8, Arthur said, his voice dropping a register. "In the formal dining room, 4 guests. I need you to handle the service." Clara paused her polishing. "I usually finish my shift at 6, sir. Maria handles evening service." "Maria talks too much," Arthur replied smoothly. "And she shakes when she pours the coffee. It annoys me. You don't shake." It was a test. He was pulling her out of the shadows, dragging her into his operational orbit. He wanted to see if the woman who had calmly bandaged his bleeding knuckles while he had a panic attack could maintain that same icy composure when surrounded by the actual monsters. Clara wiped the cloth over the polished wood, the lemon scent sharp in her nose. "Will there be dinner?" "Just drinks and coffee." Arthur stood up. He walked around the desk, his presence instantly shrinking the massive room. He stopped 2 feet away from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "Keep your eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. If voices get loud, you do not react. Do you understand?" Clara looked up. She met his gaze directly. "Pragmatism, Mr. Moretti, remember?" Arthur's jaw tightened. He held her stare, the air between them thick with a sudden, localized tension. 8 o'clock, Clara. Don't be late. The formal dining room was a cavern of dark wood and heavy velvet drapery. A crystal chandelier hung above a long table that could comfortably seat 20. Tonight, it seated 5. Clara stood in the corner near the heavy oak sideboard, a silver tray resting perfectly balanced on her left hand. She wore her formal evening uniform, a high-collared black dress, white apron, hair pinned back tightly. She was a ghost. She was part of the furniture. Arthur sat at the head of the table. To his right sat 2 men in sharp tailored suits, capos from the Northern Territories. To his left sat a man named Sullivan. Sullivan was older, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been violently rearranged with a blunt instrument several times in his youth. He ran the shipping docks. He was loud, abrasive, and currently sweating through his expensive silk tie. "The margins are shrinking, Arthur," Sullivan barked, slapping a thick hand flat on the table. The crystal glasses rattled. "The Union is squeezing us on the cargo fees, and the Coast Guard has doubled their patrols. I'm losing 10% on every shipment that sits on the water for more than a day." Arthur took a slow sip of his espresso. He didn't blink. "The margins are fine, Sullivan. You're getting sloppy." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The 2 capos across the table stiffened, their hands dropping subtly beneath the edge of the mahogany. Sullivan's face flushed a deep mottled purple. "Sloppy? I've been running those docks since your old man was catching strays in the Bronx. You don't tell me I'm sloppy." "Clara," Arthur said. His voice was calm, cutting through Sullivan's rising volume like a scalpel. Clara stepped forward instantly. She walked to Sullivan's side, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. She picked up the silver carafe of coffee and refilled his cup. She didn't look at his face. She didn't look at the heavy black steel of the Sig Sauer resting casually on his lap beneath the napkin. She stepped back to her corner. Her hands did not shake. Arthur watched her retreat before turning his attention back to the sweating man. "My father is dead, Sullivan. I am not. And I am telling you, you are sloppy. You missed a payoff to the harbor master last month. That's why the Coast Guard is sniffing around your containers." "That's a lie," Sullivan spat. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The medical tape on his right hand flashed under the chandelier light. "I don't lie," Arthur said quietly. It was a terrifying sound. The quiet was a vacuum, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. "And I don't tolerate theft. The 10% you claim you're losing, it's sitting in an offshore account in the Caymans under your wife's maiden name." Silence descended on the dining room. It was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a fatal car crash. Sullivan's hand twitched beneath the table. Arthur moved faster than Clara's eyes could track. His left hand shot across the table, grabbing Sullivan by the throat. He didn't stand up. He just applied a sudden, crushing pressure. Sullivan choked, his eyes bulging as his hands flew up to claw at Arthur's wrist. The capo to Arthur's right stood up. A gun instantly materialized in his hand, aimed squarely at Sullivan's forehead. Clara stood by the sideboard. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. But she didn't move. She didn't gasp. She watched the violent, brutal reality of Arthur Moretti unfold exactly as he had described it the night before. He felt nothing. She could see it in his eyes. They were completely dead, blank. Arthur held Sullivan there for 10 agonizing seconds, watching the older man turn purple, watching the panic set in. Then he let go. Sullivan collapsed back into his chair, coughing violently, dragging in ragged, wheezing breaths. "You have 48 hours to wire the money back into the family accounts," Arthur said, pulling a crisp linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiping his hand. "Then you are going to retire. You will move to Florida. If I see your face in this city again, I will have you packed into one of your own shipping containers and dropped into the Atlantic. Get out." Sullivan didn't argue. He scrambled out of his chair, stumbling over his own feet, and practically ran for the heavy double doors. The two capos stood up, nodded respectfully to Arthur, and followed him out. The doors clicked shut. The dining room was empty, save for Arthur and Clara. Arthur remained seated at the head of the table. He stared at the empty chairs, the half-drunk glasses of scotch, the spilled coffee pooling on the mahogany. The deadly kinetic energy slowly drained out of the room, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. He didn't turn around. "You can go, Clara." Clara walked over to the table with her silver tray. She began clearing the glasses. She picked up Sullivan's cup, wiping up the spilled coffee with a cloth. Arthur finally turned his head to look at her. He searched her face for the horror he knew should be there. He had deliberately orchestrated this. He wanted her to see the monster. He wanted to shatter the strange, quiet sanctuary she had provided him by forcing her to witness the reality of his existence. "Did you hear what I said?" he asked, his voice harsh. "You told me to go," Clara replied calmly, stacking the crystal glasses. "But the table needs clearing. The wood will warp if the alcohol sits overnight." Arthur stood up violently. The heavy chair scraped backward with a loud screech. He stepped into her space, towering over her, the smell of violence and adrenaline still clinging to his clothes. "Stop cleaning," he ordered. Clara stopped. She held the tray, keeping her eyes fixed on a spot in the center of his chest. "Look at me." She tilted her head up. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. They weren't wide with fear. They were deeply, profoundly sad. Arthur recoiled slightly, as if she had slapped him. He had braced himself for terror. He had braced himself for disgust. He hadn't braced himself for pity. "I told you," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I told you what I was." "I know," Clara said softly. "Then why aren't you running?" Clara looked at the brutal lines of his face, at the tight defensive posture of his shoulders. She saw the little boy who had inherited a crown of thorns and learned to wear it by hurting everyone around him. "Because a frightened dog bites, Arthur," she said, "and right now you look terrified." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the tray on the table. This time, Arthur didn't try to stop her. August hit the city like a physical blow. The air turned stagnant, thick with humidity and the smell of hot asphalt. The estate's massive air conditioning units hummed constantly, struggling against the oppressive heat. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting in the dining room. Arthur had become a ghost. Clara saw him only in passing. A dark suit moving swiftly through a hallway, a heavily guarded motorcade leaving the front gates, a low voice behind the closed doors of his office. He had stopped requesting her for evening service. He had stopped leaving her instructions. He had retreated entirely into the brutal mechanics of his world. The rumors filtered down to the servants' quarters in hushed, panicked whispers. The Sullivan situation had spiraled. A rival family from the South Side was using the vacuum to push into the docks. There had been violence. A warehouse burned down. A lieutenant found dead in the trunk of a car. The estate was locked down. The guards patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders instead of sidearms. The heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway were reinforced. Clara kept her head down. She scrubbed the marble. She polished the brass. She ignored the tightening coil of tension in her chest every time a car sped up the driveway late at night. It was a Tuesday, 11:45 p.m. Clara was sitting in her room, the small fan on her dresser oscillating, pushing warm, stale air across her face. She was reading the same page of her paperback for the fourth time. The silence in the house wasn't the usual, heavy calm. It was the silence of a drawn bowstring. Then came the footsteps. They didn't drag this time. They were steady, deliberate, and quiet. Clara closed her book. She didn't freeze. She just waited. The knock was a single, firm rap of a knuckle against the wood. She stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Arthur stood in the hallway. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't bleeding. He wore a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans. He looked cleaner than she had ever seen him, stripped of the expensive suits and silk ties. But his face was a portrait of exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. His jaw was covered in a heavy shadow of stubble. He didn't look away this time. He looked straight into her eyes. "I'm sober," he said. It was a statement of fact, offered as a justification. "I can see that," Clara replied quietly. She kept her hand on the doorknob, keeping the threshold between them blocked. Arthur looked past her, glancing at the small, cramped room. He saw the rolled-up silk rug shoved under the bed. He let out a breath through his nose. "It's been a bad week, Clara." "I've heard. They tried to hit my car this afternoon on the expressway." He delivered the news with chilling nonchalance. "Two SUVs boxed us in. My driver took a bullet to the shoulder. We made it out." Clara's fingers tightened on the brass knob. The casual proximity to death made her stomach turn, but she kept her face blank. "I'm glad you are unharmed, sir." Arthur's jaw clenched. "Stop calling me that." "It's what you are." "Not right now." He stepped closer. The scent of him, clean soap, and the sharp metallic smell of adrenaline washed over her. He didn't push the door open, but his physical presence demanded space. "Right now, I am a man who hasn't slept in 72 hours because every time I close my eyes, I see the interior of a burning car." "You have a dozen bedrooms upstairs, Arthur. You have guards outside every door." "I don't want a guard," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly pitch. "I want quiet, and the only place in this entire God-forsaken house where it's actually quiet is in this room." Clara stared at him. The line they had drawn weeks ago was dissolving. The first time he had come to her door, it was an accident of intoxication and panic. This was a choice, a deliberate, conscious choice to seek out the one person on his payroll who treated him like a human being instead of a warlord. "If you walk in here," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, "you don't get to pretend it didn't happen tomorrow morning. I will not scrub the floor and call you sir while you act like I'm a piece of furniture." Arthur looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The intensity of his gaze was suffocating. He understood the terms. He understood the danger of letting an employee, a civilian, gain this much psychological leverage over him. "I'm not pretending anymore," Arthur said. He didn't wait for her to step aside. He reached out, his hand wrapping around hers on the doorknob. His palm was warm and dry. He gently pushed the door, forcing her to step backward into the room, and followed her inside. He closed the door behind him. The lock engaged with a soft, definitive click. Arthur stood in the center of the room. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension visibly draining from his broad shoulders. He looked like a man who had just dropped a 100-pound weight he'd been carrying for a decade. He walked over to the narrow twin bed and sat down on the edge. He took off his shoes, lining them up neatly against the wall. Then he lay back, resting his head on her single thin pillow. He stared up at the peeling paint on the ceiling. "Sit with me," he requested. It wasn't an order. Clara walked over to the wooden chair. She sat down, crossing her arms over her chest, watching him. "Read your book," Arthur said, his eyes already drifting shut. "Read out loud. I don't care what it is. I just need to hear a voice that isn't asking me for permission to kill someone." Clara picked up the paperback from her dresser. It was a cheap thriller, completely inappropriate for the moment, but she opened it to her bookmark. She began to read. Her voice was steady, a low, rhythmic murmur in the hot, still room. Arthur's breathing slowed. The tight, harsh lines around his mouth softened. Within 10 minutes, he was asleep, utterly defenseless in the room of a woman who earned minimum wage to clean his toilets. Clara stopped reading. She watched his chest rise and fall. She had let the wolf into the house, and now he was sleeping at the foot of her bed. There was no going back to invisibility after tonight. The armor was permanently breached. Arthur slept until noon. Clara didn't wake him. She didn't put on her gray uniform. She sat by the small window, drinking a cup of bitter instant coffee, watching the heat shimmer off the asphalt driveway outside. Above her, the estate was a hive of nervous energy. Footsteps pounded across the hardwood floors. Voices barked orders through the intercoms. The war was escalating, and the general was missing. Let them panic, she thought. At exactly 12:15, the bed frame groaned. Clara turned her head. Arthur sat up. He didn't shoot awake with the paranoid violence of the first time. He woke up slowly, rubbing a heavy hand over his face, feeling the thick stubble on his jaw. He looked at the peeling paint on the ceiling, then at Clara. "I slept," he said, his voice thick with sleep and disbelief. "You did," Clara replied. She took a sip of her coffee. "Your capos have been paging the kitchen all morning, trying to find out if you left the grounds. Maria told them you were at a discreet meeting in the city." Arthur let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Maria is a terrible liar." "She is, but they are too scared to verify it." He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and rested his elbows on his knees. The harsh midday light filtered through the small window, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look like a boss right now. He looked like a man who had just finished a double shift at a steel mill, battered, sore, and deeply human. "I need coffee," he muttered. "I only have instant." Arthur looked at her. "I'll take it." Clara stood up, walked to the small electric kettle on her dresser, and made him a cup in a chipped ceramic mug. She handed it to him. He didn't complain about the taste, even though she knew he imported his beans from a private farm in Colombia. He held the warm mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms. "You didn't put the uniform on," he noted, his dark eyes scanning her plain jeans and white t-shirt. "You said you weren't pretending anymore," Clara answered evenly. "Neither am I. If I walk out there in a maid's dress after letting the head of the family sleep in my bed, I'm just playing a part. I don't like acting." Arthur took a slow sip of the terrible coffee. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was heavy, but it was a comfortable weight. It was the weight of a shared secret. "The Bianchis are making a push for the shipping routes," Arthur said suddenly. The operational details fell from his mouth without filter. He wasn't boasting. He was just tired of carrying it alone. "They bribed a judge to freeze our Shell accounts, and they've been hitting the transport trucks on the I-95 corridor. It's a coordinated chokehold." Clara leaned back against the wall, crossing her arms. "So, what is your move?" "We hit back, harder, uglier." He stared down into the black liquid in his mug. "We have to make an example of the next crew we catch on our territory. If we don't, the other families will smell blood in the water. It's simple math." "It's butchery." He didn't flinch. "Yes, it is." He looked up, meeting her gaze. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was presenting the ugly, rotting core of his life and waiting for her to turn away. Clara didn't look away. "Then why are you down here, Arthur? If the math is so simple, go upstairs, put on the suit, and order the butchery." "Because every time I give the order, a piece of me turns off," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And I'm running out of pieces. I sit in that office, and I look at the men who work for me, and I realize I don't trust a single one of them. I'm a king locked inside a vault. I have everything, and I have nothing." He set the mug on the floor and stood up. The small room suddenly felt microscopic. He walked over to her, stopping just a foot away. "I came down here because when I look at you, I feel grounded. You aren't trying to steal from me. You aren't trying to kill me. You just—" He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering inches from her face before gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was terrifyingly tender. "You just see me." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his skin, smell the sleep and soap on him. She knew she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Stepping forward meant falling into a world where people were shot in the street for a fraction of a shipping route. "I see a man who is trapped," Clara said softly. "But you built the cage." "I inherited the cage," Arthur corrected. His hand dropped, his fingers lightly tracing the line of her jaw. "But you're right, I locked the door." He leaned in. It wasn't a demanding kiss. It was a question. Clara didn't pull back. When his lips met hers, the exhaustion and the cynicism melted away, replaced by a desperate grounding heat. Arthur pulled her against his chest, his hands gripping her waist like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. There was nothing gentle about it. It was bruised, heavy, and raw. When they finally broke apart, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. His breathing was uneven. "I have to go upstairs," he whispered. "I have to finish this war with the Bianchis." "I know. Stay here," he ordered, the edge of the Mafia boss creeping back into his voice. "Don't go to the upper floors today. Stay in this room." Clara stepped back, her expression returning to a mask of pragmatism. I need to do the laundry. The machines are in the basement. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The basement? Nowhere else. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back at her. The suit was waiting for him. The blood was waiting for him. I'll come back, he said. I'll be here. The attack didn't happen at night. It happened at 3 p.m, in broad daylight, while the sun baked the estate grounds. Clara was in the basement laundry room. The industrial washing machines were rumbling, vibrating the concrete floor beneath her feet. She was folding a stack of white towels when the first explosion hit. It didn't sound like a movie. It sounded like a massive, wet thud that shook the dust loose from the ceiling joists. The fluorescent lights flickered, buzzed violently, and died. The basement plunged into emergency red lighting. Clara dropped the towels. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't scream. Panic was a luxury for people who didn't understand violence. Clara understood it perfectly. Gunfire erupted above her. It sounded like a string of heavy firecrackers popping in rapid succession, muffled by the thick flooring. Then came the shouting. The heavy, frantic boots of the estate guards sprinting across the first floor. The Bianchis hadn't waited for Arthur to strike back. They had brought the war to his front door. Clara moved immediately. She abandoned the laundry carts and ran toward the small utility closet at the back of the basement. The rules of the house were gone. The only rule now was survival. She slipped inside the closet, closing the metal door softly, and wedged a heavy wooden push broom under the handle. She backed into the darkest corner, crouching behind a stack of industrial bleach boxes. The smell of chlorine burned her nose. She pulled her knees to her chest and covered her ears, trying to block out the sounds of a tactical assault happening directly above her head. "Stay in this room," Arthur had said. She wished she had listened. For 20 minutes, the house tore itself apart. The gunfire was deafening. Clara heard the shattering of glass, the heavy, sickening thuds of bodies hitting the floor, the frantic screams of men bleeding out. It was a mechanical, brutal symphony of death. Then the heavy caliber fire stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of a predator searching for the last survivors. Footsteps descended the basement stairs. They were slow, heavy. Clara held her breath. She closed her eyes tightly. Crunch, crunch, boots stepping on shattered glass. The intruder was moving through the main laundry area, kicking over carts. "Check the back," a rough voice barked. It wasn't one of Arthur's guards. The accent was wrong. Clara pressed her hands over her mouth. Her lungs burned. Footsteps approached the utility closet. A heavy hand rattled the metal handle. The wooden broom shaft creaked, taking the strain. "Doors jammed," the voice grunted. "Shoot the lock," a second voice ordered. Clara curled into a tight ball, squeezing her eyes shut. Before the gunshot could ring out, a new sound cut through the basement. A suppressed thwip-thwip. A wet, choking gargle echoed outside the closet. A heavy body hit the concrete floor. "What the fu—" the second voice started. Thwip. Another thud. Silence returned to the basement, thick and suffocating. Clara didn't move. She didn't trust the quiet. "Clara!" The voice was rough, out of breath, and terrifyingly calm. "Arthur." She scrambled out from behind the bleach boxes, kicked away the broom, and shoved the door open. Arthur stood in the center of the laundry room. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand. His white dress shirt was soaked in blood. a massive dark crimson stain that covered his left shoulder and chest. Two bodies wearing tactical gear lay dead at his feet. He didn't look at the bodies. He looked at Clara. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a gravelly bark. "No," Clara gasped, stepping over one of the bodies. She looked at his chest. "You're bleeding." "It's a graze," Arthur dismissed it instantly, stepping forward and grabbing her arm. His grip was iron. "We have to move. The main house is compromised. The guards held them off, but the perimeter is breached. I have a car waiting at the service exit." He didn't give her time to process. He pulled her toward the heavy steel doors leading to the exterior loading dock. The estate grounds were a war zone. Two black SUVs were burning on the main driveway, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the humid summer air. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, police finally responding to the assault. A black armored sedan idled by the service gate. The driver, a young capo with a bloody cut over his eye, had the rear door open. Arthur shoved Clara into the back seat and climbed in after her. "Drive! The safe house in the city!" The car tore out of the gate, tires screaming on the asphalt, leaving the burning, shattered ruins of Arthur's empire behind. Inside the car, the adrenaline began to crash. Arthur slumped back against the leather seat, the pistol dropping to the floorboard. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. The blood on his shirt was spreading, soaking into his jacket. Clara didn't panic. She ripped the hem of her t-shirt, wadded up the fabric, and pressed it hard against his shoulder wound. Arthur flinched, his eyes flying open. He looked at her, pressing the makeshift bandage into his flesh. His lips curved into a dark, cynical smile. "You always end up cleaning up my blood, Clara." "Keep quiet," she ordered, pressing harder. "You talk too much when you're going into shock." He reached over with his good hand, covering hers. His palm was smeared with blood, staining her skin. "I told you," Arthur whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying clarity. "I'm not pretending anymore. Neither are you." The safe house was a penthouse apartment overlooking the skyline. It was cold, sterile, and heavily fortified. 3 days had passed since the attack on the estate. The city had descended into chaos. The news ran continuous loops of the gangland warfare, while the police clamped down on the shipping yards. The Bianchis had failed to kill Arthur, and into the criminal underworld, a failed king strike was a death sentence. Arthur's surviving capos were hunting them down in the streets. Clara sat on the edge of a pristine white leather sofa. She was wearing a gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks that one of the guards had purchased for her. Her cheap, sensible clothes from the estate were gone, burned along with her small room. Arthur walked into the living room. His arm was in a sling, his shoulder heavily bandaged by the discreet mob doctor who had met them at the apartment. He looked pale, exhausted, but the frantic energy of the war was fading. He was back in control. He carried a heavy black duffel bag. He dropped it on the glass coffee table with a solid thud. Clara looked at the bag, then up at him. "What is that?" $200,000 in untraceable cash, Arthur said evenly. "A passport with a new name, flight tickets to Vancouver, a deed to a small house in the mountains." Clara stared at the bag. The cold reality of the situation settled over her. The fairy tale was over. The harsh light of day had returned. "I see," Clara said quietly. Arthur sat down on the armchair across from her. He leaned forward, resting his good arm on his knee. The mask was back, but there were cracks in it. The dark eyes were tired, haunted. "You saw it, Clara," he said, his voice flat. "You saw the basement. You saw the bodies. This isn't a game. It's a meat grinder, and I dragged you into it." "I walked into it," she corrected him. "You were making minimum wage to clean floors. You didn't sign up to dodge bullets." Arthur gestured to the bag. "Take the bag. Go to the airport. The driver is waiting downstairs. You will disappear. The family will not look for you. I will not look for you." Clara looked at the money. It was everything she had ever worked for, neatly stacked in banded hundreds. Freedom, safety, an exit strategy from a life of scrubbing other people's dirt. She reached out, unzipped the bag, and looked inside. The smell of old paper and ink drifted out. Then she zipped it back up. She stood, picked up the heavy duffel, and dropped it on the floor next to the table. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Don't be stupid, Clara. Pragmatism, remember?" "I am being pragmatic," Clara said, crossing her arms. "If I take that bag and go to Vancouver, I will spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows, wondering if a car backfiring is a hitman. I will live in a quiet house in the mountains, and I will be entirely alone. You will be alive. I was alive before I met you, Arthur. I was alive and completely invisible." Clara stepped around the coffee table, closing the distance between them. She looked down at him. "You came to my door because you were drowning. You told me you couldn't do this anymore. You told me you needed me." Arthur looked up at her, the cold exterior fracturing. "I do need you. That's why you have to leave. If you stay, my enemies will use you. You become leverage. You become a target. I am already a target. The Bianchis know who I am. They saw me in the car with you." Clara knelt on the carpet in front of him, bringing herself eye level with the feared Mafia boss. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his uninjured knee. "You don't get to push me away to save your conscience, Arthur. I didn't run from the blood on your knuckles in that tiny room. I'm not running from this." Arthur stared at her. The silence in the penthouse stretched, pulling taut. He was a man used to giving orders, used to controlling the narrative through intimidation and violence. But here, on the floor of a sterile apartment, he had absolutely no power over the woman kneeling in front of him. "If you stay," Arthur said, his voice a low, ragged whisper, "there is no going back. You are not a maid anymore. You are in the circle. You carry the weight of this family. I know. It's ugly, Clara. It will never be clean." "I've spent my whole life cleaning up messes," Clara said, a cynical, grounded smile touching her lips. "I can handle yours." Arthur let out a shuddering breath. He reached out with his good hand, threading his fingers into her hair, pulling her forward until their foreheads rested together. The tension that had been keeping him upright for 3 days finally snapped. He surrendered. "We rewrite the rules," Arthur muttered against her skin. "I won't keep you in the dark. I won't lie to you. But when I tell you to get down, you get down." "Deal," Clara whispered back. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no white picket fences or sudden moral epiphanies. The man holding her was still a monster to the rest of the city. He still ran an empire built on violence and extortion. But as Arthur held her in the quiet penthouse, surrounded by the remnants of a turf war, Clara knew one thing for certain. He was her monster now, and she was exactly where she needed to be. The line between survivor and sinner is never clean. If you were captivated by Clara and Arthur's gritty descent into the shadows, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with anyone who craves a romance grounded in raw, unapologetic reality rather than fairy tales. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming deep dives into the criminal underworld and the twisted love stories that burn within it. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the bag of money or stayed for the mob boss? Let's talk about it.